on the morning of July 7, 1944, on the northern end of the island of Saipan in the Central Pacific. A Japanese army officer named Sake Oba stood in the darkness before roughly 4,000 men and prepared to lead them in a single mass assault against the American lines. The men around him had been drinking through the night. Some of them were wounded. Some were carrying nothing more than sharpened bamboo poles. The Japanese commander on Saipan, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, had already written his final order and was preparing to commit suicide in his command post. What Oba and the men around him were about to attempt was the largest infantry charge in the entire Pacific War. The American forces on the other side of that line were holding a position equipped with coordinated artillery networks, pre-registered fire zones, specialized anti-infantry ammunition that had been designed specifically for a moment like this one. To understand what happened over the next several hours, why it happened the way it did, it is necessary to go back much further than July 1944. It is necessary to understand what the Imperial Japanese Army believed about the relationship between willpower and firepower, why that belief had seemed reasonable at one point in history, how an entirely different theory of war, built in American artillery schools and tested in European and Pacific campaigns, had made those beliefs not merely incorrect, but catastrophic. The doctrine that produced the Banzai charge had roots that were genuine and, in an earlier military context, partially justified. The Imperial Japanese Army had grown out of the Meiji Restoration of the 1870s, initially absorbing Western infantry tactics and emphasizing disciplined firepower and organized maneuver. But by the 1890s, and increasingly through the 1930s, a parallel current had taken hold inside Japanese military culture. Drawn from the philosophy of Bushido and reinforced by the concept the Japanese called Gyokusai. That translates as the shattering of a jewel, and which held that death in battle was categorically preferable to the dishonor of surrender. The militarist government that controlled Japan by the early 1930s had incorporated this philosophy into training at every level, from the conditioning of enlisted soldiers to the operational doctrine published by the Army Infantry School. That instructed commanders that spiritual willpower and aggressive forward movement could overcome material disadvantages in the hands of troops who were truly committed to the attack. That doctrine had worked in China. Between 1931 and 1937, Japanese infantry units had repeatedly driven larger Chinese formations from defended positions through aggressive frontal assault, accepting high casualties to close the distance and fight at bayonet range, where superior Japanese training and unit cohesion tended to decide engagements. The Chinese Nationalist Army was not a uniform force. Its equipment varied enormously between units. Many formations were armed primarily with bolt-action rifles and lacked the machine gun density that would have been necessary to stop a disciplined mass assault before it reached the line. Japanese commanders watched their men take defended positions that Western military doctrine would have considered impossible to storm frontally. They drew the obvious conclusion. They concluded that the charge worked. What they did not yet understand was that the charge had worked against a specific set of conditions that would not transfer to a war against American forces. The United States Army in the Pacific by 1943 was not the Chinese Nationalist Army. It was a force that had spent 2 years absorbing the lessons of Guadalcanal, learning from every engagement, systematically building out a combined arms system in which artillery, infantry, armor, air support were integrated into a single coordinated mechanism that no element of Japanese tactical thinking had adequately accounted for. The American artillery coordination system that the Japanese would eventually run into was not a simple matter of having more guns. The guns themselves were only one component. What made American artillery devastatingly effective was the command and control architecture built around it. A system in which forward observers moved with infantry units, communicated target coordinates and fire corrections back to batteries by radio or telephone, could request and receive concentrated fire on a position within minutes. Pre-registered fire plans meant that American artillery commanders had already worked out the precise coordinates of terrain features in front of their lines, so that when an assault crossed those features, the guns could place shells on those coordinates immediately, without the adjustment process that slowed unregistered fires. And American doctrine had extended this further, developing the practice of massing the artillery of multiple adjacent divisions into a single, coordinated fire plan, controlled through a unified headquarters, so that a single attacking force could find itself simultaneously targeted by guns belonging to 2, 3, or 4 divisions at once. The specialized ammunition this system used against infantry assaults had been developed in part specifically because of experience in the Pacific. The 37mm canister round, distributed to American anti-tank gun units across the theater by December 1943, was essentially a large shotgun shell scaled up to artillery dimensions. The round traveled approximately 50 feet before a timed fuse detonated it, releasing steel pellets in a widening cone 30 yards across at maximum effective range, each pellet moving at nearly 1,500 feet per second. A single round could kill or incapacitate multiple men in a tightly grouped formation. Artillery sergeants who had survived the Guadalcanal campaign were brought back to training schools and assigned to teach new crews how to use this ammunition in defensive situations. Specifically, because the situations those crews would face in the Pacific were not the same as the armored vehicle scenarios for which anti-tank guns had originally been designed. The Japanese charge was not coming in behind steel plate. It was coming in on foot, en masse, at night. The weapons available to stop it needed to reflect that reality. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, who commanded the Japanese garrison on Iwo Jima, understood this calculus well enough that he explicitly forbade his men from conducting Banzai charges at all. He had studied American firepower, concluded that mass frontal assaults against coordinated American defenses would accomplish nothing except the rapid consumption of his entire force, chose instead a strategy of deep underground fortifications and prolonged attritional defense. His decision would cost the Americans dearly. The fighting on Iwo Jima lasted 36 days and produced some of the highest American casualty rates of the Pacific War. Kuribayashi's approach was the correct tactical response to American firepower dominance. The tragedy, from the perspective of Japanese commanders who did not think as he did, was that so few of them reached the same conclusion before leading their men across open ground into pre-registered kill zones. The situation on Saipan in the pre-dawn hours of July 7, 1944, was the opposite of what Kuribayashi would later attempt on Iwo Jima. General Saito had decided that the remaining organized strength of the Saipan garrison, supplemented by walking wounded and armed civilians, would be committed in a single mass assault against the American line. The assault column was assembled in the darkness north of the American position held by the 27th Infantry Division and elements of the Marine divisions on its flanks. The men were formed into dense waves. Officers carried swords. The intention was to overwhelm the American line through sheer weight of numbers, penetrate to the rear areas, destroy artillery emplacements and supply dumps, inflict enough damage to disrupt the American advance. There was no expectation of a sustained tactical victory. The charge was gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel. It was an honorable death rather than a surrender. At approximately 4:45 in the morning, the assault began. The officers came first, as tradition required, with swords raised, shouting, followed immediately by thousands of men in dense formation, moving south toward the American line. They found a gap between the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 27th Division's position and poured through it. American units at the point of contact were overrun almost immediately. Soldiers were fighting at arm's length. The sheer mass of the attack in its initial minutes was sufficient to shatter local American positions and push the assault deep into what had been rear areas, past supply dumps and medical stations and artillery batteries that were now directly in the path of several thousand screaming men. What followed over the next several hours was the systematic destruction of the attacking force by exactly the system it had been designed to stop. American artillery batteries that found the charge approaching their positions did not withdraw. They lowered their howitzers to near flat trajectory and fired into the oncoming mass at direct fire range, converting indirect fire weapons into enormous close-quarters guns. Marine artillery on the flanks continued to place concentrated fire on the routes the attacking column was using, hitting the dense formations from angles that maximized the kill radius of each round. Navy gunfire from ships offshore added additional fires to the coordination network. Machine gun crews, mortar teams. Individual riflemen worked inside a framework in which no Psi NGL weapon was operating independently. This was because the command structure linked them all together. A battalion commander later described the assault as resembling a cattle stampede. The men simply kept coming. Wave after wave, across ground already covered with the dead from the previous wave. The American guns kept firing into them. Individual American soldiers did remarkable things in those hours. An officer who would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor killed more than 30 attackers with a pistol and a heavy machine gun before he was killed. A wounded private propped against a tree stopped 8 attackers with 8 rounds from a sidearm. A dentist defending a field aid station held off nearly 100 men with a machine gun. These individual actions were possible because the larger fire coordination structure was simultaneously preventing the attacking force from being able to mass its own effort effectively, routing men through terrain that had already been worked over by artillery, breaking up unit cohesion among attackers, reducing the coherent human wave into a series of increasingly disorganized grow-ups running through fire from multiple directions. By the time daylight came fully over Saipan on July 7th, and the assault had finally spent itself, more than 4,000 Japanese soldiers were dead on the ground between the original Japanese assembly area and the depth of the American rear. American casualties in the engagement numbered close to 1,000 killed and wounded. The ratio was approximately 4-to-1 in the Americans' favor, achieved in circumstances where the attacking force had successfully penetrated the American line, reached the rear area, was fighting at close range with whatever it had, including sharpened poles. The coordinated American fire system had produced that ratio under the worst possible conditions for American defenders and the best possible conditions for a mass assault tactic. It had still destroyed the attacking force comprehensively. The fall of Saipan carried consequences that extended well beyond the island itself. Within weeks of the battle's conclusion, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government collapsed in Tokyo. The Japanese civilian leadership, confronted with the loss of Saipan, and with it the practical elimination of the defensive perimeter that had been promised to shield the home islands, concluded that Tojo had failed to accurately represent the military situation to the Japanese people. What had been represented as a defensible outer ring had turned out to be a series of island garrisons that American forces were systematically reducing, one by one, behind a curtain of coordinated firepower that the doctrine of spiritual willpower and mass assault had no answer for. The American artillery coordination system that had performed this work on Saipan was not a sudden invention. It was the product of years of doctrinal development, of lessons absorbed from Guadalcanal in New Georgia and Tarawa, of forward observers trained to stay with the infantry in the worst conditions on Earth and keep the radio working, of artillery commanders who had drilled their batteries on pre-registration until the process of placing accurate fire on a known coordinate was as fast and reliable as any mechanical process could be made. It was also the product of the specialized ammunition programs, the canister rounds and the variable fuse shells, and the incremental improvements to the fire control network. That American ordnance engineers had been developing specifically for defensive engagements against mass infantry assault. The Japanese doctrine had been built on the experience of China in the 1930s. The American system had been built on the experience of fighting the Japanese. One system was designed for the war that had already happened. Captain Sakai Oba survived the charge on July 7th. He gathered a group of survivors in the hills of northern Saipan and continued a guerrilla resistance for more than a year after the island was declared secure. Finally, surrendering in December 1945, months after the formal Japanese capitulation had already been signed aboard the USS Missouri.